The dust never settled in Clearwater Creek, even on the calmest days when the sun hung like a brass button in the cloudless sky. Fine particles of earth danced in the air, coating everything in a thin film of red-brown grit. Margaret Callaway had grown accustomed to the taste of it on her lips, the feel of it between her teeth. It was the taste of poverty, of endless struggle, of a life that seemed determined to grind her down as surely as the wind wore away the rocks. She stood at the washboard behind their ramshackle house, her raw hands working mechanically through the pile of clothes. The lye soap stung the cracks in her skin, but she barely noticed anymore. Pain had become as constant a companion as the dust itself. From inside the house came the sound of her brothers' voices, raised in yet another argument. Cards slapped against the wooden table, followed by the clink of coins. What few remained. "Damn your eyes, Thomas. That was my last dollar. Should have folded when you had the chance. Henry, Lady Luck don't favor fools." Margaret's jaw tightened. 3 brothers she had, and not one of them worth the powder to blow him to hell. Thomas, the eldest at 32, had inherited their father's weakness for whiskey and cards. Henry, 2 years younger, possessed a mean streak that had only grown worse since their parents' deaths. And Samuel, barely 25, followed his brothers, lead with the blind loyalty of a beaten dog. The screen door banged open, making her flinch. Thomas emerged, his face flushed with drink, despite the early hour. His shirt hung open, revealing the pale chest of a man who'd never done an honest day's work when he could avoid it. "Margaret," his voice carried that particular edge that meant trouble. "Get in here." She dried her hands on her apron, already worn thin from too many washings. "I've got work to finish, Thomas." "The washing can wait. We need to talk." The way he said talk made her stomach clench. She'd heard that tone before, when he'd sold their mother's wedding ring, when he'd traded away their father's rifle, when he'd bartered off everything of value they'd ever owned. But surely there was nothing left. They'd already scraped the bottom of the barrel and found only splinters. Inside, the house was dim and stifling. Flies buzzed around the remnants of last night's meal, and the air reeked of stale tobacco and spilled whiskey. Henry sat at the table, shuffling a deck of cards with practiced ease, while Samuel slouched in the corner, picking at a splinter in the wooden wall. "Sit down, Maggie," Thomas said, gesturing to a chair. "I'll stand." Her voice stayed steady, though her heart had begun to race. "Whatever you've got to say it quick. I've got work." Thomas exchanged glances with Henry, who smirked in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Thing is, sister, we've got ourselves in a bit of a bind." "When don't you?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Henry's smirk vanished. "Watch your tongue, girl. You're not too old for a lesson in manners." "Let me handle this," Thomas said, though his eyes had hardened. "We owe money, Maggie." "A lot of money." "To the wrong sort of people." Quote. Margaret felt the familiar weight of dread settling on her shoulders. "How much?" Quote, $500. The number hit her like a physical blow. 500 might as well have been 5,000. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious," Henry interjected. "And if we don't pay up by week's end, we'll be dead in truth." Samuel finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "They mean it, Maggie. Jake Morrison don't make idle threats." Jake Morrison, everyone in Clearwater Creek knew the name. He ran the saloon, the gambling tables, and had his fingers in every dirty deal from here to Tucson. Cross him, and you'd be lucky if they found enough of you to bury. "So what do you expect me to do?" Margaret asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "I've got nothing. You know that. You've already taken everything." Thomas stood, pacing to the window. He stared out at the dusty street beyond, shoulders tense. "There is one thing. One way out." "No." The word came out sharp as a gunshot. He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something that chilled her to the bone. Not cruelty exactly, but a complete absence of conscience. The look of a man who'd weighed his sister's life against his own and found hers wanting. "You haven't even heard the offer." "I don't need to. Whatever you're thinking, the answer is no." Henry slammed his hand on the table, making the cards jump. "You don't get to say no. This is our lives we're talking about." "And what about my life?" Margaret's voice rose despite herself. "When has that ever mattered to any of you? Coleman Black wants a wife." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the stifling air. Margaret stared at Thomas, certain she'd misheard. "Coleman Black?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've lost your minds. The man's a savage." "He's the richest rancher in 3 territories," Thomas countered. "Owns half the valley and more cattle than God himself, and he's willing to pay." "Pay?" The word tasted like bile. "You mean buy? You want to sell me like livestock?" Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "It ain't like that, Maggie. You'd be his wife. All legal and proper. Better life than you got here." "A better life," Margaret's hands clenched into fists, "with a man who's killed more men than cholera, who they say talks to wolves and practices heathen magic, who no decent woman would go near." "Rumors," Thomas said dismissively. "Wild talk. The man's just different." "Keeps to himself because he's mad as a rabid dog," Henry added. Henry stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Mad or not, he's offered $600 for you. Cash money, enough to pay Morrison and have something left over." $600, she repeated. The price of her life, her freedom, her future. Margaret felt the room spinning around her, the walls closing in like a trap. "I won't do it." "You will." Thomas's voice had gone cold as winter steel. "One way or another, you'll go to him. Because if you don't, Morrison will kill us, all of us. And then what do you think happens to you? A woman, alone, no family, no protection. You know what this town does to women like that?" She did know. She'd seen the hollow-eyed creatures who worked the rooms above the saloon, aged before their time, diseased and desperate. At least as Coleman Black's wife, she'd have a roof, food, some semblance of respectability, even if it came attached to a man who made decent folk cross the street to avoid him. When? The word came out as a whisper. Thomas's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Day after tomorrow. He'll come for you at dawn." 2 days. 2 days of freedom left. Margaret turned and walked out without another word, ignoring Henry's victorious chuckle and Samuel's guilty silence. She made it to the backyard before her legs gave out, dropping her to her knees beside the wash bucket. The wet clothes lay forgotten as she pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to hold back the tears, but they came anyway, hot and bitter as the desert wind. She cried for the parents who'd died and left her to these wolves in brothers' clothing. She cried for the dreams she'd once harbored, modest dreams of a small home, a kind husband, children who'd know love instead of neglect. Most of all, she cried for the girl she'd been, the one who'd believed that family meant something. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood, Margaret finally stood. She wiped her face with her apron and returned to her washing, movements mechanical but determined. If she had only 2 days left as Margaret Callaway, she'd spend them with her dignity intact. That night, she crept out onto the sagging porch. The desert stretched endlessly before her, bathed in silver moonlight. Somewhere out there, Coleman Black waited in his fortress of a ranch, probably no more aware of her as a person than he would be of a horse he'd purchased sight unseen. The stars wheeled overhead, countless and cold, indifferent to human suffering. Margaret had never felt so small, so utterly alone. Yet as she stood there, something stirred within her. They could sell her body, force her into a stranger's bed, take away her name and her freedom. But there were things inside her they could never touch. She would survive this. She would endure. And somehow, someday, she would find a way to be free. The morning came wrapped in a shroud of red dust. Margaret stood at her bedroom window, watching the sun claw its way above the horizon like something desperate to escape the earth's grip. She had been awake since the first cockcrow, her few possessions already packed in a worn carpet bag that had belonged to her mother. Downstairs, she could hear Thomas moving about, unusually sober for the occasion. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he paced, nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm. Even he, it seemed, felt some unease at what they were about to do. Margaret dressed carefully in her best dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. She braided her long auburn hair with steady hands, though her stomach churned like a butter churn. In the cracked mirror, a pale young woman stared back at her, green eyes too large and a face grown thin from worry and want. "He's coming!" Samuel's voice cracked from downstairs. "I can see the dust!" Margaret's hand stilled. Through her window, she could indeed see a plume of dust, rising from the east, growing larger with each moment. Her time had run out. She descended the stairs with measured steps, chin high, despite the trembling in her legs. Her brothers waited in the front room. Thomas attempting to look authoritative, Henry smirking with satisfaction, and Samuel unable to meet her eyes. "Remember," Thomas said, "you're to be respectful. This man is our salvation." "Your salvation," Margaret corrected quietly, "built on my bones." The sound of hooves grew louder and then stopped. Heavy footsteps crossed the porch. Thomas yanked open the door before the knock came, eager as a merchant displaying his wares. Margaret's first glimpse of Coleman Black stole the breath from her lungs. He filled the doorway like a force of nature, tall enough that he had to duck his head to enter. The morning light caught on hair black as a raven's wing, worn longer than was fashionable, tied back with a leather cord. His face was all hard angles and shadows, high cheekbones that spoke of Indian blood, a jaw that could have been carved from granite, and eyes the color of whiskey held to firelight. Those eyes swept the room once, dismissive of the men, before settling on Margaret with an intensity that made her want to step backward. He wore black from head to toe, black shirt, black vest, black duster that fell to his boot heels. The only color came from the silver of his belt buckle and the ivory handles of the twin colts riding his hips. Every line of him spoke of controlled violence, of a man who'd walked with death so long it had become a comfortable companion. "Mr. Black," Thomas stammered, extending his hand, "welcome to our humble." "The girl." Black's voice was low, rough as gravel. He ignored Thomas's outstretched hand entirely. "That her?" Quote. Margaret bristled at being discussed like livestock, but before she could speak, Thomas rushed to answer. "Yes, sir, this is Margaret. Margaret, come here." She stayed where she was. "I have eyes, mister," Black said evenly, "and ears. If you've got something to say about me, you can say it to me." Henry hissed in warning, but Black's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. He stepped fully into the room, and suddenly the space seemed too small to contain him. "Spirited," he observed, still addressing Thomas. "She's been properly raised," Thomas said quickly. "She can cook, clean, mend, all the wifely duties. She's just upset about leaving home." "This is home?" Black's gaze traveled over the squalid room, taking in the empty whiskey bottles, the cards still scattered on the table, the general air of ruin. "Seems to me I'm doing her a favor." Margaret found her voice. "A favor? You call buying a woman like a broodmare a favor?" This time, Black did look at her, really looked at her, and Margaret felt the force of his attention like a physical weight. "I call it a business arrangement, Miss Callaway. Your brothers need money and need a wife. Simple as that." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "A man like you could have any woman in the territory. Why buy one who doesn't want you?" "Because," he said slowly, "a woman who doesn't want me won't have expectations. Won't talk about love or tenderness or any of that foolishness. She'll do her duty. I'll do mine, and we'll both get on with our lives." The coldness of it made her shiver. At least her brother's cruelty came from weakness. This man's came from something far more dangerous, complete indifference. "I haven't agreed to this," she said. "No." Black reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch heavy with coin. He tossed it to Thomas, who caught it greedily. "Count it." 600 as agreed. Thomas's fingers shook as he opened the pouch, spilling gold coins onto the table. The sight of so much money rendered him temporarily speechless. "Wait," Margaret said desperately. "Just wait. I need." "I'm not ready." "Got your things?" Black asked, cutting through her protests. "She's packed." Henry volunteered, eager to move things along. "I'll get her bag." Everything was moving too fast. Margaret felt like she was drowning, swept along by a current too strong to resist. Henry returned with her carpet bag, thrusting it at Black, who took it without looking away from Margaret. "Any goodbyes you need to say? Say them now. We've got ground to cover." Margaret looked at her brothers. Thomas was still mesmerized by the gold. Henry watched her with satisfaction, already calculating his share. Only Samuel showed any sign of shame, his face red and his eyes fixed on his boots. "Goodbye, then," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "I hope that gold brings you all the happiness you deserve." Thomas finally looked up, perhaps hearing the curse in her blessing, but Black was already turning toward the door, clearly expecting her to follow. "Come on, girl. Daylight's wasting." Quote. Margaret had a wild impulse to run, to bolt out the back door and keep running until she reached Mexico or California or anywhere else. But Black seemed to sense her thought, pausing in the doorway to look back at her. "You can come willing or not," he said quietly. "Makes no difference to me, but one way or another, you're coming." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. This man would chase her down like a wayward calf if necessary. Margaret straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked past him out the door, determined to salvage what dignity she could. His wagon waited outside, a sturdy buckboard pulled by two massive draft horses. On the seat sat a grizzled older man with skin like leather and eyes that missed nothing. "This is Ezra," Black said, helping Margaret up onto the seat with surprising gentleness. "He runs the household. Anything you need, you tell him." Ezra touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." Black swung up beside her, taking the reins with practiced ease. The wagon lurched into motion, and Margaret couldn't help but look back one last time at the house that had been her prison for so long. Her brothers stood on the porch, Thomas counting coins, Henry grinning, Samuel waving uncertainly. Then they rounded a corner, and her old life disappeared behind a cloud of dust. The journey stretched before them, endless as a nightmare. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly, and Margaret pulled her bonnet forward to shield her face. Beside her, Black drove in silence, handling the team with an ease that spoke of long practice. The landscape changed as they traveled, the scattered buildings of Clearwater Creek giving way to open desert. Saguaros stood like ancient sentinels, their arms raised in benediction or curse. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermals with lazy grace. In the distance, mountains rose like broken teeth against the brilliant blue sky. "Water," Black said eventually, passing her a canteen. Margaret drank gratefully, the lukewarm water tasting better than wine. "How far is your ranch?" "Half a day's ride. We'll be there by sunset." Half a day sitting beside this stranger who owned her now. Margaret searched for something to say, some way to understand the man she'd been sold to. "Why do you need a wife so badly you'd pay for one?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "A ranch that size needs a woman's hand. Been too long without one. You could hire a housekeeper. Hired help comes and goes. A wife stays, whether she wants to or not." He glanced at her then, those amber eyes unreadable. "You always this full of vinegar?" "When I'm being kidnapped, yes. Not kidnapping when money changes hands. That's commerce." The casual way he said it made her temper flare. "Then what am I? Your property?" "My wife. Or you will be, once we reach the ranch. Judge Hartley will be waiting to make it legal today." Margaret felt panic rising again, but I thought, I need time. Time for what? To plan your escape? To hope your brothers grow consciences and come for you? His laugh was harsh as a crow's call. "Best get those notions out of your head now, girl. You're mine, bought and paid for. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him. Not ever. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent. They stopped once to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. Margaret noticed how the animals responded to Black, coming to his whistle, standing quietly as he checked their hooves and adjusted their harnesses. Whatever else he was good with beasts. When they resumed travel, the landscape began to change again. The desert gave way to grassland, vast stretches of golden prairie that rippled like a sea in the wind. In the distance, she could see cattle, hundreds, maybe thousands, dark shapes moving slowly across the range. "There," Black said, pointing. "That's the beginning of my land." Margaret looked where he indicated and gasped. The ranch stretched as far as the eye could see, an empire of grass and sky. In the distance, backed by a range of purple mountains, she could make out a cluster of buildings, barns, corrals, and a house that looked more like a fortress than a home. "All this is yours." "Every acre, every head of cattle, every blade of grass," he said, pride in his voice. "Took me 15 years to build this spread. Started with nothing but a horse and a rope and too much stubbornness to quit." Despite herself, Margaret was impressed. Whatever else Coleman Black was, he'd built something remarkable here. As they drew closer, she could make out more details. The main house was built of stone and timber, 2 stories tall, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. It looked solid enough to withstand siege, thick walls and windows placed high. Ranch hands moved about their business, stopping to stare as the wagon approached. "They're not used to seeing women here," Black said. "You'll be the first in a long while." A man emerged from the house as they pulled up, elderly, dignified, wearing the black coat of his profession. "Judge Hartley," Margaret realized with a sinking heart. They really meant to do this today. Black helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong on her waist. For a moment they stood close, and she could smell leather and horse and something wild, like sage after rain. Then he stepped back, all business again. "Judge, appreciate you coming out." "Coleman," the judge said. His eyes softened as they rested on Margaret. "Miss Callaway, I presume." She nodded, not trusting her voice. "This is highly irregular," the judge continued, looking between them. "Marriage is a sacred institution, not to be entered into lightly. I need to know this is what you both want." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, to scream that no, this wasn't what she wanted at all. But then she thought of her brothers, of the gold they'd already be spending, of what would happen if she refused now. Black wouldn't take her back. Her brothers wouldn't return the money. She'd be ruined, cast out with nowhere to go. "It's what needs to be done," she said finally. The judge frowned but nodded. "Very well. Shall we proceed?" And so, as the sun touched the horizon and painted the sky in shades of fire, Margaret Callaway became Margaret Black. The ceremony was brief, the vows traditional. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Coleman brushed her cheek with lips that were surprisingly soft, a kiss so quick she barely felt it. "Welcome home, Mrs. Black," he said, and the words sounded more like a prison sentence than a greeting. That night, she lay alone in a room larger than her entire family's house, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new home. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, long and mournful. Margaret pulled the covers higher and wondered if she'd simply traded one form of captivity for another. But at least here, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, the cages were gilded and the guards wore softer faces. The rooster's crow came too early, pulling Margaret from dreams of her mother's garden. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then, the unfamiliar weight of fine linen sheets and the size of the bed brought reality crashing back. She was Margaret Black now, wife to a stranger in a house that felt more like a fortress than a home. Pale dawn light filtered through heavy curtains. She rose, wrapping herself in the robe that had been laid out for her, soft wool, finer than anything she'd ever owned. The house was quiet as a tomb as she ventured into the hallway, her bare feet silent on polished wood floors. She found the kitchen by instinct, following the smell of coffee and bacon. Ezra stood at the massive stove, working with the efficiency of long practice. He glanced up as she entered, no surprise on his weathered face. "Morning, ma'am." "Coffee, please," she said softly. She accepted the steaming cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. "Where is Mr. Black?" "Out with the dawn, same as always. Checking the herds, writing the boundaries. Men like him don't know how to rest." Ezra set a plate before her, eggs, bacon, biscuits with honey. "You'll want to eat up." Got a full day ahead. What kind of day? The kind you learn what it means to run a ranch house this size. Quote. His eyes were not unkind, but there was warning in them too. Mr. Black don't hold with idleness. Everyone works here, from the lowest hand to the lady of the house. Margaret bristled. I've worked every day of my life, mister. Just Ezra, ma'am. And I don't doubt it. But this ain't no 4-room shack in town. This house has 12 rooms, not counting the smokehouse and cellar. There's meals for 20 men when they're all in from the range. Washing that never ends. Mending, cooking, preserving. The previous housekeeper left 6 months back, and we've been making do since. Why did she leave? Ezra busied himself with the stove. Mr. Black can be particular, takes a certain constitution to weather his moods. Before Margaret could ask what he meant, the back door slammed open. Coleman Black strode in, bringing with him the scent of horse and morning air. His eyes found her immediately, taking in her robe and tousled hair. You're up, he said simply. Good. He poured himself coffee, drinking it black and scalding. Ezra will show you your duties. I'll expect dinner at 6 sharp. We eat in the dining room. And where will you be? The question came out sharper than she intended. He paused at the door, looking back. Working, same as you should be. Then he was gone, leaving Margaret staring after him, anger bubbling up in her chest. Her husband of less than 12 hours couldn't spare more than a handful of words. Don't take it personal, Ezra said quietly. He's not much for conversation. Or company. Then why did he want a wife? She muttered. That's a question you'd best ask him yourself. The morning passed in a blur of instruction. Ezra showed her through the house. The parlor, library, dining room, Coleman's study, which she was not to enter without permission, the 4 bedrooms upstairs, the vast kitchen with its pantries and cold storage. Everything was well made but stark, functional rather than comfortable. No pictures on the walls, no flowers, she murmured. Bachelor's house, Ezra said. Been that way a long time. By noon, Margaret's head spun with all she needed to remember. The ranch hands began drifting in for the midday meal, rough men with sun-weathered faces who looked at her with curiosity and suspicion. She served them beef stew and cornbread, feeling their eyes follow her every move. So, you're the new Mrs. Black? One of them said, a young man with sandy hair and an easy smile. Tom Garrett, ma'am. Pleased to meet you. Mr. Garrett, she nodded politely, aware of the sudden tension in the room. Best mind your manners, Tom, an older hand warned. Boss finds out you're making. Eyes at his wife, you'll be picking. Your teeth out of the dirt. Tom flushed and dropped his gaze. Margaret escaped to the kitchen, cheeks burning. Ezra handed her a bucket and brush. Floors need doing, he said simply. She spent the afternoon on her knees, scrubbing floors that already looked clean. Her dress, one of her few good ones, was soaked through, her hands raw from soap. It was no different from the work she'd done before, yet somehow it felt heavier here. The silence of the house pressed down like a weight. The sun was slanting low when she heard boots on the porch. Coleman entered, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. His eyes swept over her, taking in her disheveled state, the bucket, the half-scrubbed floor. You don't need to do that yourself, he said. We have hands for such work. Margaret sat back on her heels. Ezra said everyone works here. Not like that. He frowned, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker across his face. Concern, maybe guilt. Get cleaned up. Dinner's in an hour. I haven't started cooking yet, she said. Rosa will handle it tonight. She comes in from town when needed. He paused at the stairs, not looking back. Wear something suitable. Margaret stared after him, anger simmering beneath exhaustion. Suitable, as if she had a wardrobe to choose from. As if she were some fine lady with trunks full of gowns. Upstairs, on the bed, lay a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside she found 3 dresses, simple but well made, in colors that flattered her. A note in sharp handwriting read, "These should fit. More can be ordered." See, the gesture should have softened her. Instead, it made her feel more like property than ever. Dressed up, arranged, controlled. Still, The dresses were finer than anything she'd owned. She washed and changed into a deep green one that brought out her eyes, pinned up her hair, and went downstairs. Coleman waited in the dining room, changed into a fresh shirt, his dark hair still damp from washing. "Better," he said, pulling out her chair. Rosa, a plump Mexican woman with kind eyes, served them roasted beef with potatoes and greens. The food was excellent, but Margaret barely tasted it. They ate in silence, the clink of silverware the only sound. "Tell me about the ranch," she said finally, just to break the quiet. He looked up, surprised she'd spoken. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. If I'm to be mistress here, I should understand how it works." Something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. 20,000 acres, give or take. 3,000 head of cattle, 200 horses. 40 hands during roundup, 15 regular. We drive to Kansas come spring. Sell to the eastern markets. And you built all this yourself? Started with a homestead claim and a lot of stubborn. Bought out neighbors when they quit. Fought off rustlers and droughts. Survived floods and fire. There was pride in his voice, but also loneliness. "Why here?" she asked softly. "Why this place?" He stared into his wine. A man needs space, room to breathe without someone else's expectations closing in. Out here, the land doesn't care who your people were or what you've done. It only cares if you're strong enough to hold it. "And are you?" she asked. He looked up, eyes hard but honest. "I'm still here, aren't I?" After dinner, he disappeared into his study, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She wandered through the quiet house, feeling its emptiness like a living thing. In the library, she ran her fingers along the spines of books, Shakespeare, Milton, even novels. It surprised her. "He reads," Ezra said from the doorway, carrying a lamp. "Every night when work's done. Man's got more education than most preachers. Went to university back east before he came west." "What happened?" she asked. Ezra's eyes dimmed. "That's his story to tell, ma'am, if he ever chooses." That night, Margaret lay awake in her bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the creak of the windmill, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft tread of boots in the yard. Then she heard something else. Coleman's heavy stride pacing back and forth below. What kept him awake, she wondered. What ghosts haunted a man who built an empire, yet lived like a prisoner within it? Drawn by some pull she didn't understand, she rose and went to the window. In the moonlight, she saw him standing in the yard, still as a statue. Then a shape emerged from the shadows. A wolf, massive and gray. Coleman didn't flinch. He extended a hand, and the creature sniffed it before vanishing again into the darkness. Margaret's breath caught. The stories were true. He did speak with wolves. What kind of man had she married? She didn't know. But as she watched him stand alone under the vast western sky, something inside her shifted. Fear mingled with curiosity and a strange, unexpected admiration. Whatever came next, she would no longer be a silent passenger in her own life. Margaret Black had survived being sold. Now she would learn how to live.